Welcome to our show today. This will be the first part of several parts. We're going to start off with the word Elohim, get into that, but this whole thing is digging into the Most High's divine counsel. I'm Mark Webb, by the way. This is Ward Gilbert. And Ward has done some heavy research into it. We want to comment this from a scriptural Hebraic point of view, not hearsay. We want to come at it from what the text says and get our understanding from the text. And so that's what we're attempting to do. And so I'm going to begin with Ward. So you've done a lot of research on this, and we want to dig into just this word Elohim that we've all known as a plural word, but what's the reason for its plurality? And tell us about the Elohim as gods in the Old Testament.
Research I did was through Michael Heiser's research, and he has a number of books on the topic. We'll have a bibliography that you'll have access to see all the different materials available that you can go into and research if you like. The word Elohim in Hebrew is what's known as a morphological plural. We have those in English also. For instance, the word sheep is a similar type of word in that if I say I saw a sheep in the field, you know from the context and the grammar that that word is singular, that there was one sheep. But if I say I saw a flock of sheep, you know that that word is plural and there were many sheep, and it's the same word. Elohim in Hebrew is the same type of word. It's the grammar and the context that tells you if that word is singular or plural.
Gotcha.
Then what you do is look at the usages throughout the Bible of the word Elohim in context. What you'll discover is that even though in our language it's translated from Elohim to God, the English word God has a lot of attributes attached to it, whereas in Hebrew the word Elohim does not. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. So our word God with capital G has attributes like infinite, all-knowing, eternal existence, there's only one, that type of thing, all the attributes of God. In Hebrew, the word Elohim, it's designating a place of primary residence, that being the spirit world. When you see Elohim in scriptures, it's talking about a spirit in the spirit world. For instance, when a human dies and becomes a spirit in the spirit world, then a human being is an Elohim. A human being that's alive in the physical world is not an Elohim. There's no differentiation between good and bad, high and low. The scriptures designate every kind of spiritual being that's in the spirit world as an Elohim. The context tells you if it's talking about the one and only unique Elohim, which is Yahweh, the creator that made all the other Elohim. You can see that from the context, and the context will tell you if it's talking about any of the other Elohim.
Okay. So what would be, I'm sure our listeners are wanting to know, okay, well, give us some examples. Where would we go for some of the examples that you're referring to?
Well, you could look at Psalm 82, where it talks about the members of Yahweh's heavenly council, also known as the divine council. The scriptures refer to the gods of foreign nations as Elohim. For instance, in 1 Kings 11:33, there's other scriptures that refer to demons as Elohim. For instance, Deuteronomy 32:17. And then the spirits of the human dead, you can see that in 1 Samuel 28:13. Things like angels of the Lord, for example, in Genesis 35:7.
So all of these are going to give those examples that you had explained.
Right.
Okay.
Psalm 82:1. God takes a stand in his own congregation. That word in the first verse is that God is Elohim. And then it says he takes a stand in his own congregation. He judges in the midst of the rulers. That word rulers is Elohim. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Vindicate the weak and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and destitute. Yahweh is standing in the midst of his divine counsel and rendering a judgment to them because they have failed to carry out his will.
Okay.
And so he's telling them they've failed and now they're going to be judged.
So I know that you've talked about this, the word watcher or holy one. Is this word an idol? Is it not an idol? What can you tell us about this word?
Well, the word watcher is a type of Elohim. And a good example would be in Daniel 4:13. Daniel says, I saw in the visions of my head as I lie in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and top off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. A message is being brought to Daniel by an Elohim, a spiritual being that is known as a watcher, also called a holy one.
So Daniel's calling this watcher, obviously from the text in verse 13, a holy one, and one that has come down from heaven.
Exactly.
So it can't be an idol, and it can't be something from the demonic world or from the from Satan's realm, Satan's realm.
Right.
Okay. Is Daniel 4:17 also? Did you read 4:17 as well?
Daniel 4:17, the sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will and sets over it the lowliest of men.
So again, we're seeing here this word watchers is associated with holy ones. So these are holy beings within the kingdom in heaven, but they're called watchers.
The Second Temple literature, for instance, in Enoch, you see much more discussion about the watchers and their functions, which is covered by Dr. Michael Heiser in a video called Reversing Herman, the Sin of the Watchers. I'm going to show a couple clips from that video.
Sin of the Watchers in its original context. Again, this is First Enoch material. I'm not going to quote Genesis 6 because you all know that. But I'm guessing a lot of you have never read the Enoch story. So let's just go through some of the basic parts of it. When the sons of men had multiplied, and in those days beautiful and comely daughters were born to them, and the watchers, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them, they said to one another, come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the daughters of men, and let us beget for ourselves children. And Shemhaza, their chief, said to them, I fear that you will not want to do this deed, and I alone shall be guilty of a great sin. So apparently it was his idea, and he's like, I don't want to only be blamed when this thing just goes to hell in a handbasket. And they all answered him and said, let us swear an oath. Let us all bind one another with a curse, that none of us turn back from this counsel until we fulfill it and do this deed. Then they all swore together and bound one another with a curse. Now, you notice the deed, again, is cast in sexual tones. You know, let's go have children. But the real crime, I don't think we should miss. Again, if unseen realm, there's actually two views of sort of the supernatural perspective of Genesis 6. I don't want to leave this section without saying this. The real crime is that they want to raise up their own nations. They want their own populations. They want to imitate God without his permission. It's kind of a Gnostic flavor to that, if you know a little bit about Gnosticism. So this is what's going to become the real issue here. They were all of them 200, and they descended in the days of Jared onto the peak of Mount Hermon. Okay, Hermon is the key location. And they called the mountain Hermon because they swore and bound one another with a curse on it. Okay, this Hermon in Hebrew is related to, it's a better way to say that, same root as Karem, again, the devote to destruction, to put under the ban, that sort of thing. So there's an association there between the terms. These and all the others with them took for themselves wives, and among them such as they chose, they began to go into them and defile themselves through them. Again, they defiled themselves. This is a transgression of heaven and earth. To teach them sorcery and charms, and to reveal to them the cutting of roots and plants, and they conceived from them and bore to them great giants. Asael, another character, taught men to make swords of iron and weapons and shields and breastplates and every instrument of war. He showed them metals of the earth, how they should work gold to fashion it suitably, and concerning silver to fashion it for bracelets and ornaments for women. He showed them concerning antimony and eye paint and all manner of precious stones and dyes. So in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Genesis 6, 1 through 4 precedes the flood. Okay? It's just that in Genesis 6, 1 to 4, those 4 verses, to us, key thought here, to us, lack context. We read them and it's like, well, what does that have to do with the flood? Why are these 4 verses even here? I mean, you get to verse 5 and okay, everything that man does is wicked. We get that. And then Noah starts to have this conversation with God, and then we have the flood narrative. Well, what do the 4 verses have to do with this? We lack the context. An Israelite, again, a literate Israelite, would not have lacked the context. That's the disconnect. A literate Israelite would know, oh, these 4 verses sort of compress this story that, is really a response to Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia has the same story. And the writer just sort of took it for granted, that people are going to know what I'm talking about. I don't need to just rehash all this stuff. And this is a precursor to the flood. People living in the Second Temple period had the context as well. We just don't, because we don't read that stuff. We don't read the literature of the great wider world to know these 4 verses in Genesis 6 are responding to something. This stuff in 1st Enoch is recovering or preserving or transmitting the larger story that Genesis 6, 1 through 4 was a response to. Okay, we lack all of that. And unfortunately, again, because of the history of the Christian church, we not only lack it, it's been kept from you. You have been cut off from it. Again, it's not like, oh, the gospel's really in Enoch, we're missing. No, that isn't the point at all. The point is that if you had read this, there are, again, things you would read in your Bible that would, okay, the lights go on. I kind of get what they're talking about here because I've read this other thing that they were familiar with. So we have an immediate disconnect. Even with the flood story, we just get these 4 verses.
Now let's take a look at some more of the Elohim and their functions. You can see that the Hebrews during the Second Temple period believed that these holy ones were a council. And you'll see that throughout the scripture too. We'll be going over a lot of verses where we see these divine council members are sitting on thrones. They're having discussions with Yahweh, participating in decision making. Made clear that it's not something that Yahweh has to have. It's something he wants to have. He wants to have a divine family. He wants to have interaction with his family members. These holy ones are also called the sons of God. They're his divine family, his divine spiritual family. And of course, even on earth, when you have these royal kingdoms, the kings would always appoint their sons to important positions within the government.
Okay.
And it's a similar type of thing.
What you're saying is that this is in text. Give us a text that would be an example of that.
An example would be in 1 Kings 22:20. We have Yahweh in a discussion with his divine council as to what he will do with the corrupt king Ahab. This is told to us from the prophet Micaiah. Micaiah is speaking to Ahab, and he says in verse 19, "And Micaiah said, Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him, on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, By what means? And he said, I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you." There is an example of Yahweh in heaven who decided that it's time for Ahab to go, and he has a discussion with his divine council on what is the means we're going to use to accomplish this. And he allows his divine council members to participate in this decision-making process, participate in deciding how this is going to happen. And we see that this one spirit that came forward had an idea that was accepted. That's what he said.
So this is an example of this, what's called holy ones, in the realm of the kingdom of heaven, having a discussion with the Almighty and giving him ideas. As it says here in this verse, one comes up and says, I will. So, okay, that's a great example. How about some definitions?
Earth is kind of modeled after the way things work in the divine realm, in the spiritual realm. You can look at God's family similar to the way things are set up here. For instance, if you look at it as a family, there's a hierarchy from the father and mother down through the children, or you can look at it as a family business, which again has a structure. It has an organizational chart, or you can look at it as the host of heaven can be looked at in many cases throughout Scripture as a military organization, having a military organizational chart. So you have beings at the top that are given more authority, that are over other beings below them, that are over other beings below them, and so on down, organized in a hierarchy.
That sounds familiar, kind of like in the wilderness, he said, put men in charge of some men over tens, some over 50s, some over hundreds, some over thousands.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you have a similar type of structure. So as a hierarchy, the definition is a system of persons or things arranged in a graded order, or in ecclesiastical terms, a body of persons in holy orders organized in graded ranks. That's the type of thing we see both here on earth and in the spiritual realm, these hierarchies.
You know, as you're saying that, I'm remembering, people might say, well, it doesn't sound like something, even though we're showing text here that shows that it does, I'm reminded of what it says in the New Testament. It says that the apostles are going to be granted authority to be judges. So they're obviously going to be judging over the people. And so that's a hierarchy system, so similar to what you're talking about. Now, that's going to be in place in the future.
And we'll find out later in Revelation chapter 2, Yeshua will share his authority with us and put us onto the divine council, replacing the 70 empty positions left open from the Psalm 82 judgment. So there were 70 of these council members that were judged and are now off divine council. There's 70 vacant seats.
Vacated seats.
There are 70 vacated seats, which we will replace those 70. Then it will be a blended council. The council will consist of divine spiritual beings and human beings.
One from each nation, 70 nations?
Probably, something like that. It will be in a hierarchy, so it's not just 70 people. There will be 70 top-level people in place that will be over a group of probably, if it's the same structure that has existed in the past, there'll be 8 close advisors. Then they'll be over a larger group, which will be over a larger group. Each of the 70 chairs will have an organization of millions.
Interesting, as you articulated that organization, what was coming into my mind was the United Nations, because you've got one representative from each nation that sets to make decisions over the rest of Earth. So very interesting. Okay, so we've looked at definitions. You've talked about several different entities are referred to as Elohim in the Tanakh or the Old Testament. What are some of those?
There's over 1,000 references throughout the scriptures to Yahweh as Elohim. And he is, of course, the top-level Elohim, creator of all the other Elohim.
Right.
Then the members of Yahweh's heavenly council, which we've talked about, but this includes the loyal ones and the ones that were disloyal. The process is still happening. Even though the judgment was pronounced in Psalm 82, it hasn't been carried out. And we had the divine council when they discussed Ahab. The gods of foreign nations are referred to. 1 Kings 11:33, it says, because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians. The word goddess is Elohim. And then Chemosh, the god of Moab, and again, that word God is Elohim. Milcom, the god of the Ammonites, God is Elohim. They have not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight and keeping my statutes. So you can see that this is talking about those who have followed after the false gods that are Elohim. False gods does not mean they don't exist. It just means that they have rebelled against Yahweh. They are supposed to be imagers of Yahweh to bring people back to Yahweh. And instead they failed. They took the worship of the people for themselves, became corrupt, and then they started ruling corruptly and choosing people to be top-level people and corrupting them, and then creating a whole corrupt world system, which in Revelation is referred to as beast systems, because they're oppressive of the people and everything's unjust and everything's not running correctly.
Okay. Psalm 82 has some very interesting things in it about this. One of them, as I was reading earlier, is this idea that he makes a statement is made in verse 6. I said, you are God, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die. and fall like any prince. So let's explain that. What's that talking about?
He's expressing his judgment on them for their corrupt ways and leading men astray, ruling corruptly and causing oppression of the people and leading them into evil. So he's saying to these divine beings, all of whom never die, they live continuously, but he's telling them, because of what you've done, the judgment is going to be that the way men die, you're going to die.
Now, there are those that would say, well, no, he's actually talking about men here. He's telling men, born of a woman, that you're God, sons of the Most High of you, but you're going to die like men. Looking at it from that perspective, I can see now that if it's men that he's talking to, a question would arise, why would he tell them you're going to die like men? Because they already know they're going to die like men. Is that about right?
Right. It renders the judgment not really a judgment.
How could a judgment to you be that you're going to die like men when you're already going to die like a man?
Right. That argument then makes Yahweh look silly.
Yeah.
It's like, why? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Because I would have looked at this saying, okay, well, wait a minute, he's talking about men are going to die, but I see what you're saying is it can't be a judgment if you're telling me as a man I'm going to die like a man when I'm already going to die like a man anyway.
Right.
Yeah. Anything else about Psalm 82, 1 through 8 that you want to
Well,
bring
a little
up?
more along the men line, it continues in Psalm 89:5, and it says, "Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones." In this verse, they're in the heavens. You don't ever see men in the heavens. This is where they are. Well, that's where the spiritual beings are, in the heavens.
Now, you would obviously have somebody that would say, well, they're referring to when the kingdom is restored and Yeshua returns as Messiah, all of the holy ones or saints are going to praise you in the heavens. Give me your thoughts on that.
Let's go back to Psalm 82 and go a little farther. In 82:7, it says, "Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince." Verse 8 says, "Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations." Okay, that phrase, "arise, O God," is resurrection language. The author is saying, because of this situation, that there needs to be a resurrection so that a just Elohim,
A righteous one.
can bring back the nations and bring them back into righteous judgment and bring them back into relationship with him.
Scripture does talk about the usher in everlasting righteousness. So this is interesting. I've never looked at this verse that way. So you're saying, arise, resurrect, O God, and judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. And I don't have the scripture in front of me, but I know that it talks about Yeshua when he comes back. All authority has been given to him. That's like inheriting, getting all the authority underneath him or in his hand. All the keys, all of the power is now in his hand. He's inherited because of what he's done, because of him arising. That's very interesting. Came about when the ark set out, Moses said, rise. You know what's interesting about this word rise? I want to show you something. This word rise is very connected to the word resurrection. So I looked at the Greek word here for rise in 1035, and it's found here in 1 Corinthians 8:14, where it says, now Elohim has not only raised the master, but will also raise us up in his power. Now, why would that be important to be connecting the two? Well, let's look at the rest of the scripture. Arise, Yahweh, and let your enemies be scattered. Let those who hate you flee from you. When it came to rest, he said, return, Yahweh, to the myriad and thousands of Israel. So in other words, when Yahushua rose from the dead, what did he say? He went and proclaimed to the captives, to all the enemies of the world, to all enemies, I now have reign and authority over all kingdoms. I now have the reigns and authority. Everything is subject to me now. So he's arose, rise, and let all enemies. What was the enemies? Well, sin and death was an enemy, wasn't it? Guess what it did? It scattered when we accepted the blood of Yeshua. Sin and death scattered. The enemy of Yahweh became our enemy, and it scattered when we took him upon us. When we became grafted into the tree, all enemies scatter. They shudder. They quake at the thought that the army and the people of God is expanding. So this is what this word means. It means to rouse, to raise up, and it specifically says from the dead. That's amazing that that Greek word means that in all of those instances.
Before we continue any farther, I'd like to take a step back and look at these rebellions and their order and structure so that we don't get confused. So we're talking about three rebellions. The first would be the fall in Genesis 3 with the Nakash and Adam and Eve. The second would be the Watchers in Genesis 6, 1-4. And the third rebellion would be the one that occurred at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, Deuteronomy 32, 8-9, and referred to in Psalm 82. So I will play a clip of Dr. Michael Heiser reviewing this material, and then we will continue.
If you asked a normal Christian, again, just your average churchgoer, but again, somebody who's not, new in the faith, why is humanity so depraved? In other words, why is the world the way it is? Why do we have all this wickedness? Why are things just so bad? The answer you're typically going to get is the fall. But if you asked a Second Temple Jew, and someone who's living in the Second Temple period, which is roughly, again, we'll just call it for round numbers, 500 BC through the 1st century AD. If you asked one of them the same question, you would not get that answer. It would be part of the answer. What you'd get, well, there are three reasons why the world is the way it is and why it's so bad. For sure, there's the fall. Something did happen in Eden. We have the initial rebellion into God's good world. We have an initial transgression, both divine rebellion, the Nakash, the serpent, and also a human rebellion. But that is not where the story ends. And typically, that is where the story ends for your average Christian. That's the only answer they have in their head. But to someone else, they would say what happened in Genesis 6, 1-4 is also really serious. Because in their worldview, they believe that the sin of the Watchers, the sin of the sons of God of Genesis 6, 1-4, had a direct impact on why humanity became as bad as it did, and why the flood was a necessity, and why there's still an ongoing problem. So they would include Genesis 6, 1-4 in their concept of depravity. They would also refer to the judgment at Babel, which we're familiar with because of Genesis 11, but I would dare say that if you've ever heard a sermon or had a Sunday school lesson on the Tower of Babel, you probably never heard Deuteronomy 32, 8-9 brought into the picture. Therefore, you never really learned the rationale for what happens at Babel and the impact that has on biblical theology in a very broad scope. This is according to Deuteronomy 32, 8-9. When the Most High divided up the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. So we know who the Most High is, we know what the division of nations is, but God did all that stuff according to the number of the sons of God. But Israel, verse 9, is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. So you have this allotment language going on. Now, if we traced, and we will in our time here, these ideas through Deuteronomy a little bit, you come out with a totally different worldview. It's the basis for why the Old Testament, really the rest of the Bible, is Israel against the nations and Yahweh against the gods. And there's an antipathy there. There's a hostility there. So the Second Temple Jew would say, well, there's three rebellions. There's three kind of events that led to contribute to why the world is the way it is. And why we as believers, we who follow Yahweh, or we who follow Christ, Yahweh incarnate, what we're up against. It's not just the Garden of Eden. It's bigger than that. And that becomes a real part of quote unquote, the unseen realm when we're talking about the black hats and the white hats, okay? All of that matters in, again, the mindset of the ancient Israelite, the mindset of the first century Jew.
Now let's get back to the Elohim that were involved in the third rebellion. The reason these spiritual beings are over the 70 nations goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 32. At the Tower of Babel, all mankind decided they wanted to make a name for themselves. They did not want to spread over the earth as Yahweh told them to do. They decided we're going to stay together and build a type of ziggurat tower where they wanted to bring the spiritual beings down to them, be with these spiritual beings and worship them and get the benefits back from these spiritual beings. They wanted to take a shortcut from what Yahweh was offering them. They wanted everything right now, which these corrupt spiritual beings they thought would offer them.
They wanted to speed up the process.
They wanted to speed up the process. You see in Deuteronomy 32, Yahweh says, okay, if you don't want to worship me and you're going to do this, that's when he executed his judgment, saying, okay, he divorced them, he disinherited them, and split them up by changing all their languages. And he said, I'm going to take 70 of my divine council members, appoint one group over each nation. So he allotted groups of people to each divine council member. So there was an allotment. So the divine council group, one divine council group was put over one nation, one group of people, and they were all given a certain territory with borders, which became a nation. So there were 70 sets of these groups with 70 sets of land and borders and nations. So there were 70 nations of people being shepherded, these holy ones that were supposed to lead these people in righteousness over time, point them back to Yahweh and bring them back to Yahweh. But they didn't do that. They became corrupt.
So a righteous shepherd had to come to be a shepherd in true righteousness, leading us back to the Almighty.
Right.
Psalm 105. O seed of Abraham, his servant, O sons of Jacob, his chosen ones. His peace. He's got his piece of land. He's got his people. But you, O Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I've chosen, descendant of Abraham, my buddy, my friend. Setting the table. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of all generations. Ask your father. He will inform you. Ask your father. Ask about the generations all in the past, the days behind you, the days of former years. Your elders, and they'll tell you, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man and he set the boundaries of the peoples. In other words, he said, you've got that piece, you've got that piece. He told this divine being, that's your piece of real estate to shepherd. You've got this piece of real estate to shepherd. You've got this piece of real estate to shepherd. I've got my piece that I'm going to shepherd, and it's called Israel. You've got your pieces, but I've got my piece. And here's where it says next, according to the number of the sons of Israel, but in the Septuagint it says, according to the number of the angels of Elohim. He gave them all pieces of real estate and people to watch over according to the numbers of the angels of Elohim that were there. You see, they were supposed to shepherd God's creation, but they failed. So guess why? That's why we have this language that Yeshua is the real shepherd. He's going to come and do the real shepherding, because the other shepherds, they didn't do a right job in shepherding the people. They failed. And this is why the enemy wants God's piece of land. They messed their pieces up. They defiled it. And here we go to the last verse. For Yahweh's portion, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh's portion is his people. Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. He gave all the angels of Elohim their pieces, but Jacob is his piece. Are you getting that? Jacob is the people of Israel, is God's portion. He gave the angels of Elohim other peoples and other portions at Babel, when the language was dispersed, when Spanish and everything else was going. But they blew it. God had his peace. And that's why the dragon wants his peace. He wants God's peace. Whether it's the land, whether it's the people, whether it's the temple, they all want his peace to defile it. And the land of Israel is his distinct portion, because guess what he told his inheritance? Abraham. Remember, it says Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. He tells his allotment, I'm going to bring you to this peace because it's my peace, and this is where you're going to dwell.
You can look at this allotment as a legal document. Each of these groups were deeded, the people to their spiritual shepherds, and the spiritual shepherds to the people and to the land. And when the spiritual beings became corrupt, they were judged and they lost their legal claim on the deed. There was no one to pick up the deeds. There was no one qualified. That's why the scriptures talk about this resurrection language. Arise, O Lord. He became qualified
To
take up those deeds and take that authority. And Yahweh the Father said, you qualify. So he transferred all the authority in those 70 deeds to Yeshua at the resurrection.
Interesting.
This is yet to be fully implemented at his return.
He took it back. Remember? Wait a minute. It says in that one passage that he gave the angels authority over the people and over the land. Guess what? In order to take that authority back, what does he got to do? If he gave it to them authority, as it said, the angels authority over the people and those pieces of land, he's got to take it back. Just like he's got to take back the bride that he divorced. There's so many things that happen at the death of Yeshua that we can't even comprehend.
These beings are still out there falsely representing themselves to be leaders and shepherds, deceiving the people and deceiving the nations, which is why Paul, in his ministry, said he had to go to all the nations and spread the word that the people were no longer bound. The people in these nations were no longer legally bound to these beings, which they knew they were up until that point, and they needed to get the message that they no longer were, and that because of Yeshua's resurrection, Yahweh wanted them to come back, and he was demanding they come back, and it was time to come back, and they needed that good news that they no longer had to feel that they were legally bound to be under the unjust rule of these corrupt spiritual beings.
Interesting. I know that you've mentioned Psalm 29 as a verse that refers to other heavenly beings are to worship the Lord. Explain that a little bit to us.
Psalm 29, verse 1, ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. This is an example of the heavenly beings, which is heavenly as Elohim. Spiritual beings are being told to give praise, to give glory to Yahweh, and it's specifically referencing these heavenly beings. The author is saying these beings are real and they are to give praise to Yahweh.
Is the word gods or is it Elohim? What's the word? Read 29, 1 and 2 again.
Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. Heavenly is Elohim, B'nai. So it's a sons of God reference.
And so people would say, well, he's talking about man.
The problem is when you go through all the Second Temple literature and the scriptures, you don't see sons of God being talked about physical human beings until you get to after Yeshua's resurrection. This divine family was first. They were the sons of God. But when there was a rebellion and a bunch of them left the heavenly council, and then we get to the point where Yeshua resurrects, all their authority is transferred to him. And then he says, now I'm going to share this authority and power with my physical human family, and I'm going to be putting them on the council. Now they are called the sons of God.
What you're saying then is when Yeshua was walking the earth, and he referred to himself, or they accused him of claiming to be the Son of God, that's equivalent to what you're saying here is he was, in their minds, Yeshua was claiming to be one of the divine council members.
Exactly. And in John chapter 10, he uses that argument to defend his divinity. people come to him and are demanding, who are you saying you are? Tell us plainly, who are you? And he tells them, the Father is in me. And they know what that means because in the earlier scriptures, anytime that phrase is used, of the angel of the Lord going before the people in the Exodus out in the desert, when the angel of the Lord is going before them, and Yahweh says, heed what he says, don't cross him. He has the power to inflict judgment or the power to forgive sins because my name is in him. To the Hebrews, their understanding was it was him.
Yahushua saved his people from Egypt. Ability to study the New Testament in Greek gives one access to the latest critical edition of the Greek New Testament. It's called the NA28. And to its textual apparatus, located at the bottom of pages, this apparatus provides cutting-edge information regarding the state of the study of the original text of the Greek New Testament. With the publication of the NA28 in 2012, a text-critical decision was made that holds significant theological implications. If in fact its reading is original in Jude 5, the committee replaced the word kurios, which in the New Testament everywhere you see Lord, it's this Greek word kurios. Now that word kurios in the Septuagint of the Old Testament, everywhere you see yod vave, that's kurios in Greek. So every time they called Yeshua Lord, they're using the same Greek word that they referred to yod vave as kurios. Same word. But what they did here is they made an interesting thing here. In Jude 5, the committee replaced the word kurios with the word Iesus. Now that's important if you haven't already turned to that reading. After considering all the available primary evidence and the latest in-textual critical methodology, here's what the verse says. But I desire to remind you who at one time knew all things that they used to say, the Lord, having saved the people from the land of Egypt, they now have replaced it with Yahushua, having saved the people from the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who had no faith. That means that the writer of Jude knew in his mind that Yahushua is the same person that did the saving in Egypt. Which makes sense because doesn't the prophet say through the voice of Yahweh, there is no other that saves but me? I am he that saves. There is no other. The statement is as awkward as it is stunning. Yeshua, as in Yeshua of Nazareth, saved a people from Egypt? Really? The text alludes to the Exodus event as narrated in the Torah. The statement, therefore, speaks about something that is historically impossible. How did Yeshua of Nazareth, born well over 1,000 years after the event, had nothing to do with the liberation of the Hebrews from the Egyptian oppression? Of course, a later scribe knew this, stumbling over this reading, and so changed the subject of the verb from Yahushua to Lord Kurios, saved a people from Egypt. That is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the God of Israel. The word Kurios is the Greek term used in the Septuagint to translate the Tetragrammaton in the Hebrew Bible. You see, learning the fullness so I can walk in the fullness. However, the New Testament documents bear witness that the earliest church held the conviction that Yahushua shared in the divine identity of the God of Israel. The NA28 reading suggests that Jude understood Yeshua to have had an active role in the deliverance and judgment of Israel in the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings. The writer, Jude, knew this understanding. It was in his mind. It was in his thought process. The author of Jude wrote, Iesus, not merely or primarily as a reference to the historical figure of Yahushua of Nazareth, but to that figure as he shared in the divine identity. Therefore, on this text-critical reading, Jude 5 becomes one of the clearest references in the New Testament to Yeshua as the pre-existent Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. The Apostle Paul possibly corroborates this idea in 1 Corinthians 10, 1-4, while alluding to Israel's exodus and wilderness wandering. He says, they all ate from the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. You think he was thinking that this same master that's feeding you the fish and the bread fed you in the wilderness? The same one feeding you now, the same one liberating you from the bondage of sin and death is the same one that liberated him 1,400 years earlier. What a thing. For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Messiah Yahushua. Scholars will continue to discuss this text critical decision. My point here is not to contribute to that debate, but to highlight that knowing Greek and having some ability to navigate this NA28 textual apparatus opens yet another entire world of exploration and study of the New Testament. Text critical decisions don't normally hold such important things as this particular example does. Most involve minor issues and readings. But in this case, the implications are staggering, contentious, and exciting. Most English translators won't reflect the significant decisions for some years to come. But students of the Greek New Testament are privy to the latest scholarly decisions regarding the state of the original text. Knowing Greek means one can read that Yahushua saved and judged a people from Egypt. That same Lord is the Lord of the assembly today, who saves and judges with power and ought to be regarded with fear, trembling, and worship.
The Hebrew rabbis looking at the passages like this throughout the Torah and the Psalms and the prophets, they see two persons having the same name, or their name being of the Father being in them. They get this idea of the two powers in heaven, trying to figure out who is this second power, who is this other being that can sit on a throne next to the Father. This is not fully revealed because Yahweh does not want the corrupt, rebelling spiritual beings to know what the plan is, that Yahweh is going to have his son die and resurrect to reclaim all the power to fix at least two problems. He's repairing the divorce disinheritance at the Tower of Babel so that those people can come back to him. He is repairing the bill of divorcement that was given to the northern kingdom. So that the one resurrection, he's repairing both of those so that the northern kingdom, the covenant can be restored with them. The nations can come back because that divorcement was fixed, and they can be grafted into the different tribes. It all hooks together to make the whole thing possible to bring all humans back to him.
Wow. Now that's interesting.
Yeah.
We could spend a 2-hour segment just talking about that piece, and maybe we'll have to come back and talk about that piece. Shalom. Thank you for joining us again on our series of the Divine Council and the Elohims. We want to thank you for joining us and tuning in as we continue this series.